So, for being totally honest here, I highly doubt that, at least among the gaming sphere, that the concept of the famous, or rather, infamous Ubisoft Formula really needs much introduction. But just in case there's anybody out there who may or not actually have heard of that term before, just to kind of summarize it, generally speaking, the Ubisoft formula simply refers to the overall school of design that Ubisoft tends to design its open world games around. Now, to be fair, I will admit that the Ubisoft formula itself isn't exactly a concrete set of rules, but it's also simultaneously something that is often pretty easy to spot when a game is abiding by it, as opposed to just any other normal open world. For example, some common elements that I think can be used to identify when a game might be taking inspiration from the Ubisoft formula are the following ideas. First of all, you gotta have towers, of course. Usually the idea is that you have a series of towers spread throughout the open world that you often have to go through some kind of climbing puzzle or generally just get to the top of them, and then when you reach the top, you unlock parts of the map that reveal more side activities and things of that sort. Speaking of side activities, oftentimes another mark of the Ubisoft formula is when you have just an absolute ocean of side activities marked by icons that just flood the map as you uncover various parts of said world. And a lot of the times, these side activities are fairly disconnected from the main storyline and are very clearly meant to serve as sort of filler to help pad the runtime of the game. Not to mention, of course, another common trait that I think we can add to the list is just endless collectibles spread throughout the game world. I'm not talking about like side quests or anything, I'm talking about just general random things to grab that may or may not even actually give you anything beyond just letting you tick a number up as you slowly amass all of the collectibles in the world. There's probably a few more traits that we could tack on to the list as well if we really wanted to hammer into it, but I think that these few different types of game design elements are kind of the most iconic elements of the Ubisoft formula. And to be fair, it's also not something that is exclusive to Ubisoft games. In fact, that is kind of the whole point of this video. There are many games not made by Ubisoft who have clearly taken inspiration from this formula, which is getting closer to 2 decades old at that point, if we're being totally honest. And some games manage to implement it in much better ways. Like, for example, there's a lot of Ubisoft elements in games like, say, Breath of the Wild that have been improved upon and tweaked, where they've changed just enough of it to make it significantly better. But other times there are games that don't really change much about the formula itself, and yet still manage to do it in a more interesting and more fun way than a more typical Ubisoft game, like, well, insert basically any Assassin's Creed game in the last 10 years here. Now, to be fair, for being perfectly honest, the Ubisoft formula did have a purpose, especially a decade and a half ago when the technology for making games was significantly more limited, and it allowed for companies to make very big, sizable open worlds a lot more easily and cheaply so that they could still make these sort of impressively scaled games. But the fact of the matter is that the world has mostly moved on as both game dev technology has improved and companies just get better design sensibilities as time goes on. For example, Elden Ring famously has a very similar mechanic of like going to certain locations to unlock new parts of the map, but instead of it being a giant tower that you need to climb and ends up getting very repetitive and boring after a while, they simply made it basically a collectible that you just interact with once, so then it gives you the local map for that new area. Even Tears of the Kingdom, which previously in Breath of the Wild followed the formula a lot more closely, they decided to basically do away with climbing towers altogether and focus more on the puzzle element so that they could have more variation in how each tower gets unlocked instead of making it so that you just have to climb each one every time. But of course, I didn't come here to talk about Zelda or Elden Ring, I came here to talk about Spider-Man. And what I think makes Spider-Man interesting is how, despite all the growth in the open world genre over the last decade, and all the changes that people have made to the Ubisoft formula in more recent open world games, Spider-Man, of all games, seems to follow the Ubisoft formula practically to the letter. A lot of people have identified this when talking about the Insomniac Spider-Man games, and frankly, I think I have to agree with it. And yet, I personally, and I know many other people who have as well, have actually completely 100%ed every Insomniac Spider-Man game to date. Meanwhile, I rarely ever complete any of Ubisoft's games themselves, if I even play them in the first place, of course. Well, first things first, especially in case there's anybody that might disagree with me on this point, we should probably go back and double check that Spider-Man actually follows the Ubisoft formula that I outlined at the beginning. So, first things off, are there giant towers to climb? Well, New York is full of giant skyscrapers. But of course, the ones that actually hold map parts are on top of giant towers as well, so I would say that this definitely, at least technically, fulfills that part of the formula. And if anything, I would actually argue that this form of the tower is actually even worse than a more typical Ubisoft formula tower is, because the whole point of locating new map parts on top of a tower is that a tower is something that stands out from the rest of its environment and can be easily found from a very large distance away. In any other typical game that follows this formula, the whole idea is that you don't have the map yet, but you can immediately know when entering an area that if you go to that location, that's where you can find the new map parts without having to rely on any kind of tools beyond your eyes to find them. But in Spider-Man, because New York is full of skyscrapers and the map parts aren't even necessarily located on the tallest ones, you basically have to rely on either minimap icons or just blind luck in order to actually unlock new parts of the map. So moving on to our next point, is there an ocean of mostly disconnected side activities marked with icons that flood your map? And, well, I think that's a big yes by my book, and again, keep in mind I'm not necessarily saying that these individual side activities are poorly designed or not fun or anything, just that the structure and the way they're presented by just absolutely flooding the map with icons would very much belong in the likes of a more recent Far Cry or Assassin's Creed and the such, because these are the kinds of things where you pretty much can only locate them because a minimap icon told you to go there, rather than more naturally discovering them throughout the world. And if we're being honest with ourselves, a lot of the side activities, like especially the random crimes that you can come across, are very much filler activities that are almost completely disconnected from things like the grander narrative and character progression, and mostly just serve as means to give the player bags of experience and things to do to pad the runtime. And of course, finally, we have endless collectibles hidden throughout the world for the player to discover that mostly just serve as a means to tick things off of a checklist before they can collect all of them. So there's a ton of these throughout all three of the Spider-Man games, so I'd say we definitely got this one in the book. And like I said, I think that overall it's just pretty easy to see the Ubisoft formula once you've kind of gotten familiar with it. So I mean, if you disagree with this kind of assessment, feel free to let me know down in the comments below. I'm always happy to continue the conversation down there, but let's go ahead and move on with the assumption that Spider-Man does follow the formula pretty closely. But that's the thing, right? I'm talking about games that I have played to completion, and I'm planning on beating the new one to 100% as well, so it may sound like I'm ragging on Insomniac Spider-Man really hard here, but clearly they're doing something different that makes this formula work a lot more. So what is it that these Spider-Man games are doing? Well, let's start with quite possibly the most obvious element.
Yeah? What's the difference?
Presentation!
Yeah, that's right. Presentation. To start with the obvious, the non-gameplay elements of Insomniac Spider-Man games are pretty much all universally considered top-notch. I mean, the graphics are amazing and have only gotten better with each entry. The animations are extremely charismatic and interesting and have a lot of juice behind them to make pretty much every element of the game feel good in your hands, and I don't think that it'd be controversial to say that the narrative in these games delivers some of the best Spider-Man storytelling in years. But of course, good presentation can only take things so far. Sure, a good narrative can carry a game, but it rarely incentivizes a player to keep playing once they've beaten the story mode and continue to go on and collect all of the various random side objectives and collectibles and whatnot, and otherwise still complete the game. So there's definitely still more going on than the game just having a good story despite following the Ubisoft formula. So with that said, I think the next point worth bringing up is that the scale and scope of these Insomniac Spider-Man games is a lot more reasonable and reined in compared to a lot of Ubisoft Formula style games. Now, to be fair, I don't have the exact numbers on how many collectibles and side quests and main quests and whatnot are in each Spider-Man game compared to, like a Far Cry or an Assassin's Creed or any other open world game, but if we just look at the typical time that it takes to beat and complete these games, for example, all three of the Spider-Man games, according to how long to beat, take less than 30 hours to 100% them, compared to, say, something like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which has a main story time to complete of over double that, with the actual 100% completion rating clocking it at over 140 hours. So, I think that just in general, these Spider-Man games tend to not outstay their welcome nearly as much, thanks to the fact that they don't go too overboard with the sheer number of side quests and collectibles. I mean, for example, the exact numbers often matter less than how long it takes to actually get each collectible, and you could just look at some recent Mario games for an example of this. I think it's actually easier to complete Mario Odyssey, despite them having over 800 moons to find, than it is to, say, complete Mario 64, even though it only has 120 stars. And that's mostly because you can find moons constantly. Like, you could be finding a moon every minute that you're playing through a level, whereas in Mario 64, you have to constantly be restarting a level from scratch and spending multiple minutes navigating it just to get a single star. So as a result, there's a lot more repetitiveness that comes to that structure, and it just takes longer to get each collectible, whereas in Mario Odyssey, you're finding them much more fluidly in the environment, and you're getting them at a much more rapid pace, which I think makes it both more engaging and easier to complete. And I think that Spider-Man is closer to the Mario Odyssey style of design in terms of being able to get your collectibles compared to the Mario 64 style. On top of that, the game also breaks down the collectibles by zone so that things are a little bit more bite-sized and approachable in general. When you look at each zone individually, they might only have 2 or 3 of any one type of collectible, and the fact that they're also breaking it down by type even further makes it easier to digest just how many collectibles are in the game. So even though there might be a ton of random backpacks or robo spiders to track down and find, when you're looking at a zone and you see, oh, I only need to find one more to complete that zone, that helps incentivize the player to actually complete that zone and get it over with. But of course, there is still one more key element of these Spider-Man games that I've neglected to mention so far, and that is for good reason. It's kind of the elephant in the room, and I've saved the best for last. And that is the traversal element. And I mean, let's be real here. Web-swinging is one of the main draws of any Spider-Man game. Like, the first question anyone asks whenever any game featuring Spider-Man has ever come out is always, how does the web swinging feel? And I think this is actually incredibly relevant to open world design. A huge reason why I think typical Ubisoft Formula style games tend to get stale, especially as you try to complete them, is because things start feeling very by the numbers as you kind of get bored of the moment to moment gameplay. It just gets tedious to keep going from place to place to clean up all the collectibles, and so inevitably you start fast traveling and taking shortcuts to just get it over with as soon as possible, just warping to the nearest location, grabbing anything you can find, and then warping to the next one to keep getting all of the collectibles. And when you've gotten to that point in a game, you've basically stopped meaningfully engaging with the main draw, the actual open world itself, and you're just basically reducing the game to marking items off of a checklist. But web swinging, acting as your main traversal mechanic throughout the entire game, tends to stop this loss of engagement from happening entirely. Basically, the entire game is practically turned into a platformer where you're regularly being engaged in the minutia of trying to not crash into a building at high speeds. And it's a very deep and well implemented mechanic as well, because different areas of the map will literally feel different to traverse, such as the bridges or Central Park compared to the main heart of the city, and things like taller buildings will give you more leeway to swing on than smaller buildings. And so, as a result, just the act of going from place to place becomes this interesting and engaging traversal challenge that keeps the player engaged with the core gameplay from the start of the experience all the way to when they're collecting their last collectible. Now, obviously, web swinging is very fun. I mean, hell, I'll boot up these games sometimes to just swing around the city and not even collect any objectives whatsoever. But it's also obviously not a universal solution to Ubisoft-style design. So, what can we learn from these Spider-Man games in order to improve open-world games in general? And I think the main takeaway to really focus on is to make sure that more of your game, especially the moment-to-moment gameplay between core objectives, remains engaging. For example, I think that considering this problem in this light can help explain why certain other games that we know follow the Ubisoft formula have done so well in the past. For example, we can take a game like Assassin's Creed 4, which even at that point in time, the Ubisoft formula was already identified and growing stale, but yet Assassin's Creed 4 is one of the most well-received games in the series. And why is that? Well, I think it's because they focus so heavily on the ship sailing mechanics and all the various piracy things you can do. Just sailing from port to port is an inherently fun and engaging thing to do. You have sea shanties that you can sing with your crew, and you can sail into and against the waves and watch your ship bob in the ocean. You can get into naval battles with other ships or fight bases along the coast, and it's just generally a fun time that doesn't need random objectives peppered throughout the map in order to pad out the runtime, so it makes going from place to place that much more fun and an engaging journey, especially compared to, say, the more typical parkour and climbing mechanics of a more bog-standard Assassin's Creed game, which, while visually interesting, rarely amount to much more thought and engagement than just holding down the dedicated parkour button and moving the joystick, which I just think isn't that fun and kind of wears thin pretty quickly. And I think that this focus on making traversal as deep and mechanically interesting as possible can even explain some of the appeal for games that don't even remotely follow the Ubisoft formula. For example, let's take a look at Death Stranding, which seemingly on the surface involves just a lot of boring walking from place to place, but there's a lot of thought and effort that goes into that game's traversal mechanics. You need to balance out your cargo and plan your route. Every single small hill and creek is an obstacle that could cause you to stumble or drop an item and potentially damage your cargo, and everything needs to be navigated as you encounter them, and as time goes on, it only gets more and more challenging when you encounter things like literal lakes and mountains that require some lateral thinking in order to traverse and navigate. But yeah, sure, Death Stranding doesn't exactly appeal to everyone, but from those that it does appeal to, I think that an often quoted element of the game that people tend to praise is the fact that the game focuses so much on these deep traversal mechanics, which makes the moment-to-moment gameplay of going from one objective to the next inherently interesting and engaging. And I think that that's really the core element that we need to be taking away here, which is that you need more than just a big map full of objectives in order to make an open world game. You need to make the time between those objectives also engaging as well, or else players are just going to get bored and possibly not even beat the game, let alone complete it. And there's lots of different ways that I think you can do this as well. Obviously, you have games like Spider-Man, which focus on just having an inherently fun web-swinging mechanic that takes you from point to point with a lot of free-form movement to go along with it. You have games like Death Stranding, which are still slow and methodical, but offer a lot of surprisingly deep mechanics in how you traverse the game. And you even have games like, say, the more recent Zelda games, where they focus more on the sense of discovery that you get from walking around the world, and making sure that no matter where you're going, you're always discovering something new and interesting in a very short amount of time, so that simply walking around the world just doesn't get boring. After all, I remember, especially when Elden Ring came out, that a lot of people were talking about the importance of the quote-unquote 40-second rule in open world gaming, which is basically the idea that no matter what direction the player goes in, they need to encounter something interesting within 40 seconds or else they'll start to lose interest because of just how boring traversing the world is. But I think that this is only looking at it from one direction of the problem, because if you can make the travel itself engaging and fun, it doesn't matter if the next objective is 40 seconds away or 4 minutes away, because if I'm having fun going from point to point, well, then I don't need a new objective every 40 seconds for me to have fun. I just am having fun playing the game. And I think that's really what Spider-Man's strength is from the get-go. So yeah, thank you for watching, and as always, I'm always happy to continue the conversation down in the comments below. Do you think that Spider-Man really does do the Ubisoft formula right? Or maybe you think that there's some other changes that they've made to that formula that really help push the game above and beyond the usual open world filler that we see from a lot of other companies? And for that matter, what are your thoughts on the newest game that just came out? I know I personally have been really liking the portrayal of Spider-Man's villains that I've encountered so far, but of course, I'm only like a quarter of the way through the game as of the time of this recording, so I still got a long way to go before I finally beat it, let alone complete it. But anyways, as always, thank you all for watching, and if you like what you saw, make sure to hit that like, and if you want to see me make more videos like this in the future, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you can get notified of when I make my next video. With that said, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.